So I initially planned to give a talk about our broader research program on chronotypes and circadian rhythms, and I will explain in a second what we mean by this. But since we only have 20 minutes, I wanted to focus on a very specific study that we just finished. So this is very kind of fresh research, and it is not fully developed, but it has generated some very interesting results, which are particularly relevant in this COVID kind of context in which this series is located. Now, if you think about COVID and all the chaos it has created around the world, we are aware of all the negative consequences of this pandemic, but maybe there is a silver lining, and maybe there will also be some positive outcomes of this pandemic, and mankind will learn something from this and will take something away from this. And you very often hear in the media in particular that one positive outcome of this whole pandemic might be that we are moving towards a more flexible workplace. So flexible in terms of flexible place where people work. So we just recently had a Zoom meeting where somebody zoomed in from the beach, it might be your home, it might be a cafe, it might be a beach, but that flexibility that people now have as a result of this pandemic to decide where they want to work. And at the moment, there's a lot of discussion around how this is actually quite challenging, because what happened now is that people, since schools were closed, people had to look after their kids at the same time while they were working at home, which was obviously not ideal. But if you continue with these flexible work arrangements beyond the pandemic, and now that schools and childcare are open again, people should be obviously enjoying having that flexibility in terms of where to work. And the same obviously holds for flex time, right? Like the ability to decide when to work, at what times. And clearly, it's not complete flex times. We still have Zoom meetings and other responsibilities and deadlines that we have to meet at certain times. But in general, because people are not being watched and observed in offices, they have more flexibility to essentially plan when they do their work and how they organize their work throughout the day. And that should be a great thing, right? It should be a great takeaway from this pandemic. And if you look at the past, for example, in 2013, Yahoo did the whole opposite. In 2013, Yahoo, which traditionally had an approach where they provided a lot of flexibility and telecommuting work arrangements to their employees. In fact, it was stipulated in their contracts, and many people chose to work for Yahoo because they were hoping to achieve a better work-life balance. From this flexibility in 2013, the CEO of Yahoo, Marisha Maya, essentially took this all back and ordered everybody back into the offices. And she said, we're not being as effective as we could be, and a lot of information is being lost. And even though you had contracts stipulating that you can work from home, we want you to come back into the offices. And there was a huge outcry, and there was a huge uproar because of that decision. And she was accused of being backward looking, and this is such an outdated policy, and any innovative, creative workplace will rather provide more flexibility than less flexibility, because flexibility means people have better work-life balances, and they're happier in their private life, they have happier family life, and then they will be more motivated, and they will be also performing better at work. Now, we wanted to actually look into this in a bit more detail and find out if that is actually the case, and we chose a very strong kind of setting to do our study. We did a study with couples in complete lockdown in Singapore. There was a time when Singapore was in a complete lockdown, and they had one of the harshest lockdowns. People were only allowed to leave. One member of the family was allowed to leave, I think, once a day to do some shopping, and they needed a permit to carry with them. So with these couples that we studied, we were absolutely sure they wouldn't work in offices. They would be at home, and they had flexibility in terms of when they worked. We controlled for this. So it were 68 couples where both were working. And we did a so-called experience sampling study. And an experience sampling study means you are observing people, following them over a certain time to sample the experience they have on a daily basis. So in our case, we did it for 2 weeks, and we sent them 2 surveys per day, one in the morning and one in the evening. It's typically sent over the phone, where they report on things such as, for example, their working times, when they worked the previous day and the current day, to what extent they experienced home conflict and work conflict, the emotions that they experienced in the moment when they were doing the survey, and also work-related outcomes. And we had one main research question. We were interested in how people's chronotypes affect their experience of having that flexibility of working from home and being flexible in terms of their working times. Now, what is a chronotype? A chronotype, in layman terms, is essentially whether you are more like a morning person or an evening person. So some people just are jumping out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they're super fit and energetic and in the morning, and they do their best work early during the day. And as the day drags on, they're becoming less effective, and they become, obviously tired. So morning people, they get up relatively early. They also go to bed relatively early. They do most of the things early during the day. While evening people are the opposite. They have problems getting up early. They're pretty much unproductive in the morning, but then during noon and when it goes into the afternoon and evening, they become more productive. That's the best time of the day. And obviously they have a hard time getting up early in the morning, but they also have a hard time falling asleep early at night. So they typically tend to stay up longer during the day. So it's a preference essentially for when you during the day prefer to do things, important things, challenging things, demanding things. And that preference has a very strong biological, physiological foundation, because all of us have so-called internal body clocks that regulate the daily functioning of our bodily functions. So essentially any species on this planet has these internal clocks that align us with the 24-hour rotations of our planet. And trains us with the light-dark cycle. Without these internal clocks, our body wouldn't be able to cope with that random 24-hour cycle that we're exposed to. If we would be on Mars or a different planet, obviously our daily rhythms would be different. So over time, evolutionary, we would have developed different body clocks. So these body clocks are everywhere in our body. In every cell are these little clocks that time us and regulate our functioning. In fact, in 2017, the Nobel Prize for Medicine was given to those people who discovered these body clocks. And these body clocks create a so-called circadian rhythm. And the circadian rhythm is our daily rhythm that reflects a lot of things that fluctuate throughout the day. You can measure it physiologically, for example, in terms of body temperature or melatonin secretion. These things fluctuate throughout the day. There are ups and downs, and it translates directly pretty much into your performance or cognitive ability. And while the circadian rhythm fluctuates and has ups and downs, for example, there's a so-called post-lunch dip. There's one unique peak during the day. And that peak determines what kind of chronotype you are. If you peak earlier during the morning, you're more like a morning type. In the middle of the day, you're more like an intermediate type. At the end of the day, you're more like an evening type. But these types are very kind of random distinctions. People can peak at any time throughout the day, at 11, 12, 1, 2. So it's a bit random to call somebody a morning type because he peaks at 11 and somebody who peaks at 11:30 an intermediate type. So we rather consider this to be a continuous variable. And they have a strong genetic, obviously, basis. So you have your chronotypes pretty much inherited from one or both of your parents. And it depends on age. So kids are very much morning people. They get up early, go to bed early. Teenagers then are the whole opposite. They are evening types. They have a hard time getting up early in the morning. That's why we have a lot of discussions around school start times for these teenagers. And then from the age of 20 to 50, we are quite diverse. People are all kinds of types. And an extreme morning person and an extreme evening person could share a bed and would never see each other because they have such opposing rhythms. And then from the age of 50 onwards, we are becoming morning people again. Now, there is a very strong bias in society towards morningness. So most important things happen rather earlier than later during the day. School exams, university exams, job interviews, important meetings, important presentations, everything typically happens rather earlier than later during the day. And that is at a time when morning people are at their best and therefore have an advantage, while evening people are always disadvantaged because they have to perform at times when they're actually not at their optimal performance. And that's why we often tend to underestimate the potential of evening types. And in addition, evening types suffer from what we call a social jet lag. So their nature doesn't allow them to easily fall asleep early at night, but very often social responsibilities force them to get up early, jobs, kids, and those things. And as a result, evening types are consistently sleep deprived. They don't get enough sleep, and that has negative consequences. Now, coming back to our study of couples in lockdown in Singapore, remember we had two diet members. One we call the employee, and the other one we call the partner, even though they were both working, right? And what you can see in this model, the first box is employee chronotype. And our hypothesis was that employees' chronotypes would affect their working times throughout the day if they have flexibility. So morning type would work earlier during the day and evening type would work later during the day. And we indeed found that during the day, working times were indeed very much predicted by people's chronotypes. But we also had this hypothesis that evening types would work back late into the night. And we actually didn't find this, which you can see here. There's a negative relationship, but it's not significant. But then we looked at the difference between the partners in terms of their chronotypes, which is here the absolute difference in chronotypes between the two partners. And we found that if that difference is large, then suddenly evening types actually work very late into the night. So why is this the case? Well, probably if both are evening types, then they still stay up longer as their nature is, but they are not necessarily engaging in work. They watch a movie together, do other things, but they do not necessarily work. However, if one of them is a morning type and the other one is an evening type, which is represented by this large difference, then the morning type will go to bed early. The evening type is still there, still awake, is still full of energy essentially. And in a flexible work environment where they can decide when they want to work, then starts working back pretty late into the night. And that has consequences. This late night work means that the next morning, the partner is angry. There's conflict between the two because the partner didn't come to bed, the partner stayed up long. Also, the morning type partner has this morning bias, believes that things should be done early in the morning. The early bird catches the worm. That saying exists in pretty much every culture, staying up late and then not getting up early in the morning, wasting time, is something that a morning person can't relate to, and in our case, led to conflicts between the two. So the partner was more angry the next morning when the employee worked until late. And also the employee, him or herself, reported much more anger the next morning, probably because he or she was working until late, didn't have time to recover, to relax, and that just has carried on effects. And remember, this has been kind of measured over a 2-week period. So this kind of piles up, when you do this consistently over longer periods of time. And then we found here that both of them were angry as a result of conflicts they had in the morning, and then they retaliated at work. They did something nasty at work, both of them. So we call this counterproductive work behaviors. So a counterproductive work behavior is anything that you shouldn't do, like saying something mean to a colleague, jeopardizing somebody else's work, talking badly about your organization, doing anything that harms your work, your colleagues' work, your organization. So what we found is essentially that the fact that one of them worked late until the night resulted in a situation where both were engaging in counterproductive behaviors the next day. However, this was only the case when there was a significant difference between the two. So what does it mean? Why is this relevant? And it brings me back to what I mentioned before in terms of flex time and flex place. Is this really a blessing? And lots of firms have now invested in this remote work technology. Many employees had to skill up. We all here at the university had to learn to teach using Zoom. By doing this, we have learned about a whole range of other technologies and platforms we can use to interact online. So it was almost like an external shock that moved all of us on. We leaped forward in terms of our technological skills into an age where remote communication and work is much more feasible. Many firms have invested in safe connections and technologies that enable employees to work remotely, VPN clients and things like this. And it is unlikely that they will just not make use of this in the future anymore. And then there's this whole discussion around office spaces in the city and how much companies pay for this and how much they could save by letting people work from home, and all the economic advantages this has on the suburbs where people stay at home and buy their coffees locally and so on and so forth. So isn't it a great new world where we're all flexible, we can all decide what we want to do and when and where we want to work? But there are limitations to this, and we have to keep this in mind. Regular, normal work schedules give a lot of people structure in their life, which they otherwise don't have. And I myself was very much a late person most of my life, and I ended up, in particular as a student, studying through all night, and being up all night, and then, sleeping through all day. And I was just miserable. I wasn't happy, about this thing which my kind of nature almost made me do. And only once, I got a proper job and I had kids and I had, structure was forced on me. I was forced to change my lifestyle, and it had a lot of positive consequences. So we have to keep in mind that not for everybody, obviously. For some people, flexible work arrangements are great, in particular for young mothers with children. That is a great opportunity to combine work life and private life. But if you look at the work-life balance literature and research, it's very much biased towards this idea of more flexibility is always better. And that's why Marisha Meyer of Yahoo was so much attacked by everybody in terms of her backward-looking, outdated kind of approach of bringing people back into the offices. In our research, we found that for some people, removing that structure, allowing them to freely choose when to work and how to work, created conflicts rather than facilitated their private life. And these private life conflicts then resulted in obviously negative emotions, negative feelings, which then also related to negative work behaviors. So we have to be aware of this. And this is true for many different, in many different kind of settings. For example, there's a lot of research on workplace loneliness, for example. Even in offices, people being alone, being not connected to colleagues or to supervisors, and the negative consequences that workplace loneliness has. And obviously, people working from home, sitting in their home offices, being detached, seeing others only through Zoom facilitates this. But there's more to this. For example, Yahoo has these beautiful campuses, Google has these beautiful campuses, work campuses, where they provide all these perks to their employees. And some of these perks are that they have free food for their employees. So they have, like in Silicon Valley, in their main campus, they have like 19 restaurants there, which all serve all kinds of different foods for their employees for free. So what they do is they monitor the queues at the food stalls, and they make sure they're not too long and they're not too short. They're not too long so people don't waste time, but also not too short so that people who would normally never meet each other from different departments who randomly stand together in a queue start talking to each other. And by doing this, people who would normally talk to each other start talking about their projects and realizing that there is actually overlap and that there are things that they can do together. This brings the most creative and innovative ideas out of people. Random hallway or office kitchen conversations often lead to the most unlikely collaborations, which lead to the most innovative and creative products. And that simply doesn't happen when people are sitting at home, right? So it requires people to be together, build personal and social connections and relationships. And this is something that we have to take away from this a little bit, I guess. This kind of excitement that we have about this whole new beautiful world where flexibility is a solution to so many things has its limitations. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing per se, but we still have to really understand what the consequences are in terms of people's personal well-being, their productivity, innovation and creativity of organizations, efficiency and performance. So there's a lot still to understand in terms of how that flexibility will play out and how it will affect people. So I think my 20 minutes are over, and I might stop here. And let's have anybody questions if there are questions.
Thank you, Stefan. So what we'll do now is, as Stefan said, go to some Q&As. If you want to ask some questions, please use Slido again. So www.slido.com and use the event code #connect1. So I think Kath is going to bring up a slide with that. So we do have some questions through already for you, Stefan. So the first one is, do you think that flexible working arrangements and working remotely is going to remain a long-term feature in the future of work?
So I do think that it will definitely be more prevalent than before. As I said, a lot of firms have made significant investments in this technology, and a lot of firms have put their toe into the cold water and have realized that things are actually not as bad as they expected it. So there was a lot of fear of giving people more freedom and flexibility in terms of their controllability and their performance and effectiveness. And many firms were forced to test this and have realized that things are not as bad as they expected to be. Keeping in mind the potential drawbacks, but I do think we will have much more flexibility after this than we had before.
Thank you, Stefan. We have another question. So will the country and cultural differences influence the research? And if yes, have an example of this. And that was also something that I was wondering when you mentioned creative industries, to wonder if perhaps the different industries would also affect the outcomes of the research.
So the question, there are cultural differences linked to
will the country and cultural differences influence the research? So if you, I guess, if you reran the survey in a different location.
I mean, the culture also affects how people structure their lives, right? So we know in Spain, for example, people going to dinner at 10 o'clock at night. So there's a very much kind of, also they have their siesta. So there's nothing going on during noon, and then they work back late into the night. So they have already adopted a very different rhythm, while China is a very much morning kind of focused country. So clearly there are differences, but this basic kind of chronotype, that is a very kind of deeply entrained genetic feature of us. And that is the same across the world. That will not change by culture. However, as you mentioned, in terms of industry, clearly there are industries where flexible work arrangements are simply impossible, right? Like in hospitality or in healthcare, people will always have to show up at work. In other industries, there's more flexibility, but the creative industries have often, essentially the whole Silicon Valley has gone back to office work. And while Yahoo forced people into offices by threatening them to cancel their contracts, Google did the opposite. They lured them into the office by creating these great work environments. But everybody wants people to be in offices because that is where the creative kind of juices get flowing. And yeah.
Thanks, Stefan. That makes sense. So we also had a question regarding how long the couples have been married and whether their chronotypes would change or converge over time. Did that make any difference to you? for the research?
We have no information on how long the couples were married, and however, the convergence of chronotypes is unlikely. As I said, the chronotypes, they evolve over time. We all know correspondingness as we are getting older, but clearly couples find arrangements in terms of how they structure their work. But suddenly you have this external shock, and one of the most important structuring factors in their lives, and that is the need to be in the office at a certain time, is removed. That obviously has a much stronger effect on than what couples may have arranged to do on weekends. I mean, work is much more, happens much more often than couples arranging, like spending time together as such. So.
Thanks, Stefan. We also, this is a great question. Did you find that early risers are on average more arrogant and insufferable than late risers?
No, I wouldn't say that. There is a lot of research on the different types, and morning types, for example, are more diligent, more attention to detail, while evening types, as research showing, they're more creative, they're more innovative, but they also score relatively low on the dark triad personality traits. So evening types suffer from more obesity, addictions, a whole range of negative consequences, depression, as a result of this consistent lack of sleep and sleep deprivation. It has a lot of negative health consequences for evening types, and also relates to a lot of negative mental health outcomes, but they also tend to be rather creative.
Excellent, thank you. So I guess onto the managerial implications of the research. How important do you feel it is then to test the chronotype for people who work in companies and businesses? Is that something that you would recommend organizations do?
Yes, I mean, I've been saying that for a long time. Essentially, organizations do put their people through extensive assessment centers and tests, and they obviously have always done personality assessments of people to understand their personality. A chronotype can be very easily measured through a questionnaire as well that is validated by physiological indicators. Now let's say you have a couple of surgeons and you have different shifts during the day, right? And you have an evening kind of type surgeon working in an early shift in the morning. He's more likely to make a life-threatening mistake, right? So you cannot always, obviously, align people's natural rhythms with their work rhythms, but it certainly doesn't hurt to look at it. And if you have a choice between different surgeons, different shifts, you know, you can try to match people's inclinations to their times during the day when they perform best.
Thank you, Stefan. So this question's about, I guess, the other variables that might come into play. And the question wonders whether other variables might decrease the positive effect of employees' night work on employees' anger in the morning. So could you introduce some other variables to cheer some people up?
I mean, yeah, I mean, the point is you don't really want people to work late. So, I mean, I guess there would be ways to do this, but is that really what you want to achieve? You know, is it just treating the symptoms, or is it actually getting to the root, the cause of the problem? You know, of course you can treat the symptoms, and you know, there are certainly things you can do to lift up their mood, but it is also not healthy for them to work so late, you know, and that would be more treating the symptoms than, you know, providing a true solution, I guess.
Sure. So we had a very specific, we talked about sectors a little bit earlier, but a very specific question about government sectors. Do you think that the flexible time would work in the government sector?
Again, it depends on what kind of roles and jobs people have, right? I mean, I cannot see why it would not work in the public sector if it works in the private sector. There are certain jobs where it's not suitable. In other jobs, it is more suitable. But keep in mind, I'm actually here saying we shouldn't go all the way to flexibility, you know? So people working in office is not such a bad thing after all.
Mm-hmm. We also have a great question here. How do we communicate our chronotype variants to employees and businesses. So is that something you mentioned, like a survey? Are there other ways to do it, or can you talk a little bit about how we would communicate with our employees on that?
You just talk about this, right? And we actually we have a lot of research which kind of indicates, for example, between leader-member diets, leader-followers, there's a lot of misunderstanding. So, for example, there's research showing that if your boss is a morning person and you're an evening type, you get worse performance evaluations than if you would be a morning type. Because you start a little later, the boss sees you walking in a little later, he thinks you've been wasted time in the morning, then he goes home at 4, but you stay actually back until 8, but he doesn't see that, right? So talking to each other, communicating each other's preferences is really about talking about work preferences and optimal alignments and arrangements to maximize people's performance is obviously absolutely something you should do. And you don't need a survey for that. Most people have a pretty good understanding what they are, right? So, and bringing this up and talking about this can resolve a lot of misunderstandings.
Mm-hmm. So another question we've got, I think, which is interesting, is how will this play out in terms of prioritizing one chronotype over the other? So would you say that later chronotypes should be managed and made to comply with business preferences that perhaps morning types are? How do you kind of negotiate that?
This is happening anyway, right? Morning types are currently forced into the morning, evening types are forced into the morning type schedule, right? Everything that happens in the morning, so they're already being forced into that pattern. And a lot of the research in the field, which is called chronobiology, which looks at this, has always argued, oh, we should give evening types more flexibility. We should allow them to align their work rhythms more with their natural rhythms. And this is true to some extent, but as we show here, for many of these people, those things give them structure in life, you know, and has positive consequences. And as such, at the moment, they are already being forced. The question now is, to what extent does it make sense to give them the flexibility to work? The priority is clearly at the morning types time.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Stefan. So this is a great question. Will there be a correlation of this study conclusions to university students and the new learning environment?
Yeah, well, that depends on the age, right? So particularly in your early 20s, people are very much evening types still, and then they're moving slowly into moving out of this evening kind of trough during their life. Students have more flexibility, I guess, but there's a lot of discussion about start times of education. That is more like in schools, right? But in particular for a year 10, year 11 kind of students that start in some countries in Europe, you start at 7 o'clock, and these students cannot absorb any knowledge at this time of day, right? So it's an absolute waste of time. And I guess similar for students depending on their age. Very early start times are not ideal.
Sure. Thank you, Stefan. So we're almost through our questions, but I have just a last one. How can I find out what type of chronotype I am? How can I mean, certainly what you said about staying up late when you're a student certainly spoke to my experience, but how can I confirm that or challenge it?
Yeah, I mean, again, most people have a pretty good understanding, right? You know, can you get up at 6 o'clock and you're like being in a good mood and you're like full of energy and you go surfing in the morning, or if you're rather the person who goes to gym late at night. But you just have to essentially Google it. There's a lot of online assessments of chronotype. There's one that's called the Munich chronotype questionnaire. It's called MCTQ. So there are chronotype questionnaires out there, online assessments that you can take, and it will give you a score, and that score indicates whether you're an extreme morning person, an intermediate morning person, a late morning person. Again, most people have a pretty good understanding. For us researchers, this fine distinction is more important than it is for most people themselves. But yeah, chronotype questionnaire, if you Google this, you'll find a lot of resources on that.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my internet, so I stopped my video for a moment there. We have, I think, one final question that's just come through, which I shall get up. Okay, so we've got it through. Any particular advice on finding compromise between divergent chronotype colleagues? How do we meet them? How do we interact with one another? How can I work better with someone who has my opposite chronotype?
For example, for us academics, it's a perfect example. If you have very different chronotypes, it's almost ideal. Like one person, we're working on an academic paper, we're writing it, right? One person works on it in the morning, passes on to the other person who continues working at it during the night. You know, so you almost have a 24-hour kind of somebody working on the paper. It depends on the context. If you have a flight crew flying a plane from Sydney to Dubai, and there are 3 pilots in the plane, you don't want them all to be peaking at the same time. The first 5 hours and be asleep the remaining 10 hours, right? You would rather have one, being alert at all times, so like distributed. But if you want to all sit together and brainstorm a solution for a problem, or we are like surgeons and operating on a patient, then we better are all at peak performance, right? So we have to ask ourselves, to what extent can we organize work in a way that we can pass it on, distribute it, share it, so that everybody can take their part and work at the time when they are best able to do? Or if that's not the case, again, how can we consider chronotype as a criteria for selecting and putting together teams so that we either have a match or don't have a match, depending on what is needed. So we have a paper on that where we look at teams actually, and where we explicitly explain when chronotype diversity, as we call it, these differences are good and when they're bad in teams, and what can be done to prevent the negative outcomes.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to Stefan for a very fascinating presentation. Is there anything you'd like to finish up with, Stefan, to have just the last word? Anything you'd like to add? Yeah, no, like
I'm a bit on a mission essentially with this whole chronotype research, because it's something that's completely neglected in workplaces. There's hardly any that take that into consideration, and it is something that obviously is not the most important thing in life, but it is definitely something we should consider and take into consideration, because it has very important consequences. And yeah, I mean, if you're interested, read up a little bit more about it, and it's quite fascinating actually, circadian rhythms and chronotypes and how they govern our daily rhythms and lives on this planet. And yeah, just something yeah, interesting to. There's actually also a very interesting book, it's called The Circadian Code, I think, where the author talks a lot about when we should eat and what effects it has on us when we eat late, and how it activates all our body clocks when we put food into our stomach too late, and then how we kind of push up our system. So it's a lot about sleep hygiene, and it's not just about work, it's about your general well-being. You can learn a lot about, obesity, losing weight, sleeping better, being more energized from this whole research, which is called chronobiology. That's all.
Thank you very much, Stefan. That's fascinating. So it only remains for me to ask you guys, the guests, to please complete a survey after the call. I think that will be distributed. And to let you know that our next Research Connection webinar is on Wednesday, the 30th of September at 3 p.m. World Back to the Future. So if you'd like to join, we'd ask you to please email business.events@sydney.edu.au. Okay, so I hope to see you all in that session. Thanks everyone. All the best.